Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. Today, it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Alex Bilyk from Silvacom. Alex, how are you doing?
Doing very well, Kevin. Really appreciate you having me on the show here.
Yeah, for sure. I'm pumped to have this conversation with you. We were joking at the start how we're both rocking our microphones, hidden away so we can have that voice, that deep radio voice. I promised I wouldn't do it. I just did. So how embarrassing is that? But hey, we saw each other in Toronto, 2 weeks ago or something of that
Yeah,
nature?
I mean that was the first in-person event since before COVID, OFIA and then CRIBE, and literally OFIA was the event right before COVID kicked off for me. So it was sort of bookends of pre and post COVID. It was really nice to
Yes.
see people.
Yeah. So for our global listeners who are saying, oh, yeah, OFIA is what for those folks?
Oh, sorry. Yes, Ontario Forest Industries Association. So it's a meeting of forest industry. So I was giving a talk there on drone technology, which I'm sure we'll get into, and then the CRIBE Next for was talking about. It was sort of funny. Chris made a tongue-in-cheek joke that all of the forest inventory solutions folks in the province were in the room, and we kind of were. It was,
For sure, for sure. And like we were all clustered, right? It's almost like this
yeah,
geographic clustering algorithm
yeah.
in our DNA that merged us all together and in size. Yeah, I agree, man. That was like awesome. I think that was my second in-person event. And it's just nice, right? Just to see people and
Yeah.
even like I don't know what it is, fist pump, elbow pump, handshake, hug, kiss. I don't know what the protocol is this, but it was just nice. It was like just so reinvigorating for the soul. So yeah, it was awesome to see you there. You gave some talks, and we'll get into that. So customary with the Digital Forester podcast, I always ask people, what's your journey? How I think people are going to be liking this story because again, it's
It's
like
a
your
dark.
boots on the ground,
It
right?
was
So tell us about
it
that.
started on a dark and stormy night, no, no, not quite that, but it was quite the journey, honestly. So if you asked me in high school, what did I want to be? The answer would have been engineer or eye doctor. And up until I was 17, that was the answer. And then I heard over the announcements this, you could apply for this summer job. It was called the Ontario Ranger Program. And so I threw an application into that and happened to get picked. And so for those that don't know, this was a program that ran in Ontario for quite a number of years. I want to say 50 plus years, where in your 17th birth year, by birth year, you applied and you could be picked to go live in a ranger camp for 2 months. So I was taken out of Southern Ontario, grew up in Southern Ontario, didn't know what forestry was. A forester was a Subaru, right? That's always been our marketing problem, still is today. But went up
Love it.
and lived in Northern Algonquin Park. And so just doing tree portage clearing, all that sort of stuff. You lived in a camp with all guys all the same age, and we started to learn about forest management, and I realized, well, this is pretty cool, this sounds really interesting. And the person that had spoken mentioned they went to Lakehead University. So which university? Never heard of that one. So did the look into that, and that winter flew up to do a tour, and the rest is history. Signed up for forestry and
Wow.
changed paths completely. And it's really funny because earlier this week I was doing drone training with the Steep Rock crew. They're the environmental crew monitoring the mine there. And the one girl was at the girls' camp that visited our camp 18 years ago.
No kidding.
Literally, yeah. And we were talking, and she
Wow.
said, "Yeah, I was in Rangers, and it got me into this." And I said, "No way, what year?" And she said, "I said, which camp did you go to?" And we visited this
Crazy.
Kaios camp. It was such a weird serendipitous moment 18 years later that yeah, we both ended up in forestry, environmental management, and there's a lot of those stories throughout the
It's
industry of
amazing.
yeah. And unfortunately that program doesn't exist anymore. They canceled it and moved it to stewardship, where you're home every night. This took you out
Yes.
of your environment. It put you in the middle of nowhere and said, welcome to forestry. You're going to learn some skills. You learned, canoeing, you learned basic trail maintenance stuff, but you learned about the industry as well. And it was a huge feeder program, I think, and it's a big loss for our industry.
Yeah, no, that's amazing to hear, right? And those programs are instrumental at that young age. And even
Yeah.
I'm curious to know your thoughts, like when we think about that in a broader conversation piece around just universities that have a forestry program, right? You got UBC,
Yeah.
Lakehead, UMB. I think U of A still has one, but U of T kind of, as you said, it merged. What do you think? What do you think? How did that come to be? And these ranger programs not getting funded? Is it public perception, or maybe lack of awareness, or foresters or Subarus and just kind of
Yeah.
plow through the snow and don't beat their chest and toot their horn? What do you think
I,
happened?
I think we're really bad at messaging, honestly. That's improved in the last couple of years, but as a profession, we've been very humble, and that doesn't always serve us well when we operate on such a social license. And so programs like that, so growing up in Southern Ontario, I lived on the mountain bike trails. I lived out in the woods, but didn't know what forest management was. It just wasn't in the vernacular at all. And so that program opened my eyes to it, and then I could share that with other people. Um, it's also a bit of a marketing thing. So the program at Lakehead changed to natural resource management and saw a huge spike in numbers, again because forestry didn't translate to kids looking into programs. So
Right.
it is a bit of a branding problem. But I always joke saying, you Google doctors, you see people; engineers, you see people; Google forester, you see Subaru. And that's always been our core challenge, I think. And that is changing. And, like you're addressing here, digital forestry and technology, when you start talking to young people and explaining the fact that, oh, you're really into technology and video games, you want to be a full-time drone pilot, their eyes just go like, what are
Yeah.
you talking about? That's a career path. And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, it absolutely is. Like there are students that I've taught previously that are now full-time drone pilots, and it's just wild to think that that's a career.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? And they're probably thinking, what? I thought it was the sumo wrestler posing
Yeah,
on the Subaru hood of the truck. That's a Forester, right? And so this
yeah,
is probably dating us, right? Some people are like, what are these guys talking about? Like sumo wrestler on a Subaru? I'm like, they're really funny commercials. So if you had a chance to YouTube that, you'll fall over laughing. Trust me, I'll
yeah.
give you $5 if you're not on the ground laughing, to our listeners after you watch them. So no connections in the family to Forester. So it's really that ranger
Well,
camp that set you off.
so my grandfather, when he came over from Ukraine, was a lumberjack in Kapuskasing, actually. So he
Okay.
worked in the woods from that side of things, but not in any kind of manager role. That was in the cut and stack, that kind of a role, and then moved down to be a welder. So growing up around him, learned the trades from him in my summers, but not that didn't feed into the forestry side. I learned the IT side of things from my father, who's more that side of technology, bringing old computers home that I could rip apart. So I learned that, and that's why I was kind of focused on engineering. And I'm sure it probably shocked and scared my parents when I said, yeah, that engineering thing, no, I'm interested in forestry now. They probably
Yeah.
thought, what you had a career lined up, and now
Yeah.
obviously it's worked out.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure your grandfather would probably says, like, Alex, you're not a real Forester back in the day,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah, you got all of that stuff, of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was all cut and split by hand, and hearing the stories from the woods and what they went through, it was it was formulative for sure to respect where they
For
came from. And it
sure.
was really cool going back to Cap for a number of training things to be able to see and walk the same ground, that many
Yeah.
years later.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now you work for Silvacom. They're
Yep.
headquartered in Edmonton, Alberta. You're on the Thunder Bay, Ontario arm. I believe
Yep.
you'll have to correct me. Title is Forest Inventory Innovation Manager.
Yes, so it's a mouthful. And where that came from, I guess, is so Silvacom, we've got staff coast to coast now, actually. So New Brunswick to
Cool.
BC, between 110, 120 employees across the board. And our biggest year in terms of hiring was last year. I mean, that's the thing with COVID and remote work and everything else, is in technology, in this technology interface with forestry, there's been a ton of growth. So we've been doing a lot of hiring. My title comes from the project that I was initially brought in from, which was the Forest Inventory Innovation Project in Alberta, looking at basically the Alberta Vegetation Inventory System. That's their forest inventory program, and saying, what is the opportunity for change within this? And so they needed someone that understood forest inventory but wasn't connected to anyone in Alberta, so there would be no sort of the politics is always half of the battle with this stuff. So I
You're
was
the
sort of
fresh meat.
I was the friend. Yeah, I was sort of the outside guru. My friend always jokes and calls me a remote sensei, and I'm just going to embrace that title,
Nice.
and say, like, understand remote sensing, but don't necessarily understand the politics of the landscape, so can ask the truly ignorant questions that need to be asked sometimes, but aren't loaded with the background knowledge that might come from there. So it was a cool role to go in and sort of spearhead. It was challenging to have to do it remotely by and large. So number of forest industry partners as well as other inventory solution partners. So we had Greenlink, Timberline, and Foresight all at the technical advisory table.
Yep.
And it was basically looking at and saying, I did a background literature review on the inventory program in Alberta. And if you looked at inventory in Alberta through that lens, it looked quite old, which wasn't representative of how things were being done. But the documentation when we started referenced grease pencils and writing on the back of air photos, and it needed a refresh. And so we managed to effect in about 16 months of work, the entire inventory standard has been revitalized now. So a new standard was just published in January of this year. And now you've got one PDF. It's not, a series of memos and interpretations and everything else that's been boiled out of it. And that's what's needed to set us up for, okay, now we agree what the current state of inventory is. Now what's the opportunity to move forward in things, and what are the barriers to that movement? So looking at other jurisdictions, and the talk that you saw, which I was again being a little tongue-in-cheek calling ideas worth stealing, is say that came from that project of let's look at other jurisdictions and see what's working, and let's not reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, amazing. And obviously you're still alive. So as the new guy coming in,
Yep.
you either found your armor and shield or you made some friends. But yeah, it's amazing to hear that come together. But before we maybe tap into some of that work, how did that come to be? Like, I know you, like, again, you studied forestry, you're doing that work, you're doing some independent consulting work. So maybe for our listeners, share a bit of that background, because I think I know you embody, the digital forester, but I think as I've been doing these podcasts, I believe there's a theme, a trend in the type of people, the DNA, whether there's a trigger event, a superhero event, or whether it's a parental thing that you just got kicked in the behind, or just being in the bush and then getting lost and then realizing, hey, if I had a digital tool, so it'd be great. But maybe tell us, fill in that gap there.
Sure.
Before you
so the origin story, right? You want the the origin story. I got
Batman
it. So
story. Yep.
Yeah. So I think for me, it was during my master's. So, graduated 0809. So not the greatest time to be graduating into anything forestry related, peak of the crash. And so I moved and did my master's, and it was sponsored by, 3 companies all in the same. Well, I say that it was Abitibi, Bowater, and Resolute, because they went into receivership while they were sponsoring my master's. But Rick Groves, who was an instrumental mentor for me, was the forestry manager there, and he kept me going as a master's. And my sole job at the time was to take the brand new ADS 40 imagery that Ontario was flying for the inventory. And he said, I'm not going to get an inventory product from this for probably 5 years at least. I need this imagery to work for me today. So your job, figure it out. So he handed me piles of hard drives. There was no instructions. And it was figure out how to make this useful for us. And so that was a challenge, to say the least. I'm sure you remember those days of the .sup socket set images and saying, how does this work and why won't it open? And so we kind of all kit bashed our way through figuring out how to get this stuff to even open. And then, so what they did is they sponsored a lab that sat at the university so that the students would also have access to it. So it was a shared resource lab, but their contractors would come in, and their contractors, who were quite old school, knew air photos, right? That we sort of went through this period of 3D photo, then Landsat came out and everyone forgot that 3D was a thing that we used in forestry for a while, but the contractors hadn't forgotten that. And they said, this is just the digital version of that. And so we got a projector working that would do 3D, and we could look at a screen together and start doing operational planning. And it started with roads. And we went from, so anyone who's done road layout, they're walking, be done in 2-dimensional GIS, and then they'd go to the field and they'd say, well, this isn't right, it missed X, Y, Z. And so I took the numbers from their GPS paths for the last year. They were walking 3.6 kilometers per kilometer of road layout when they were doing primary road layout for like ripping things out, walking back and forth. And by leveraging the 3D imagery, we dropped that down to 1.4 kilometers walk per kilometer of road laid out. And that was the real impetus of, okay, we're willing to put, the 4 hours in the lab every 2 weeks because it's saving us so much time on
Absolutely.
the back end. And so it started there. And then they said it'd be great if we could take this 3D stuff to the field. And iPads were, early on the scene. And I said, oh, how do I get this to work? And Alf, who's another big mentor and influence on me, he said, well, you used to have the technology of red blue 3D, figure out how to convert them to that. And so managed to hack my way through converting the images into a high resolution red blue 3D spatial anaglyph. And so
Nice.
you could use 50-cent glasses on your iPad or on a piece of printed paper and still you leverage the 3D in the field. And that was the real, like, okay, this is cool now. Now we're taking the expensive, complicated setup and I can put it in the machine. And the guy can be looking at it and seeing what he's in for in terms of timber development or crossings. That I think is probably what really kickstarted it for me. And then when I graduated, Resolute gave me the shot of, okay, now you can continue with this as a contractor. And basically I just had to, my role was to innovate, move the needle somehow, some way, but I was allowed to operate completely outside of their internal organizational structure. So I was able to kind of chat with folks at different levels, but I was always working with folks that were boots on the ground, doing all of the layout work or the machine operators themselves. And then we would get into larger planning meetings. They'd bring the ministry in and they'd all sit around and hash out looking at the same image. And it led to this, instead of this back and forth of emails for months, it would be, we're looking at the same image, we're talking the same
Yeah.
language.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that really solidified things for me. So yeah, 10 years of doing that. And concurrently, and I still am teaching as a sessional. So I've been teaching remote sensing now, and I feel old now. The fact that students have taught are now, superintendents for companies. So it's like, okay, this is been at this a little while now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was just gonna joke for our listeners. So when Alex talks about those anaglyph glasses, like if you go to the movie theater and get them for 3D, those are the fancy ones. We're talking about
Oh
the
yeah,
paper
old
ones,
school,
old
red
school.
blue, cereal
Yeah,
box.
yeah, yeah.
Like
So for those who can't see us, we are not white haired like
yeah,
elderly people. Like we're middle aged. So again, probably dating
exactly.
ourselves. But yeah, so very, very cool. So why don't we jump into a bit of technology? So we kind of heard the words
Sure.
drones, lidar, you name it. I know you're doing all sorts of crazy cool stuff, but maybe let's start with lidar. I know at this next for this CRIBE event, so
Yep.
you presented on this and it was kind of a coast to coast. We'll drop the top coast part since there's not really trees up way up in the Arctic per se, but interesting pan-Canadian view of what's going on. So maybe for our listeners, since we don't have enough time to go through each province, maybe what are some of those three key themes, thinking of each province, every jurisdiction kind of doing the same thing and then yet not kind of doing the same thing, and then what are the top three things you're surprised or interesting finds from that study? And then
Sure.
maybe one of the things, if you were to be king of the castle and say, you know what, all you provinces, it's like I'm going to rule you all, kind of Lord of the Rings. This is how we're going to do it, and just be quiet and do what I tell you. So maybe start with that and share some thoughts on that study and the work you did.
Sure. So I guess the biggest trend that you notice when you look coast to coast is there seems to be a lot of hybrid approach. It's not fully lidar in all jurisdictions. They're still leveraging imagery to try to answer generally the species question, and it's some form of photo interp light or something like that. Ontario being the exception to that. We'll get to that. But the idea of letting the technologies do what they do best right now and say lidar gives us great heights. We don't need one height for a polygon. We understand that either we go to a full raster based, or we can at least understand a height distribution within a polygon and the value that would give to an operations person. So that lesson learned is really key, that let the technologies do what they do best. The other one is that they're starting to, some jurisdictions are ahead of this than others, but using the other satellite products to fill in the gaps of, we tend to do these, large scale every 10-year massive inventory efforts. And then in between, it's kind of like, yeah, we grow it forward. We kind of just let it hang out, and we province by province, maybe we update fires, the boundaries of which are done, from a helicopter in some cases. They're not in the same mapping effort. We don't try to keep the fabric accurate all the way through the inventory cycle. And that's changing now. You're starting to see, Sentinel is caught on. People are starting to realize that satellite system exists. And of course, Landsat, when they opened the archive in 2009, was a huge impetus to innovation, because the best data is the one you can afford. And so when you had access to that time series, you could ask those questions. We're starting to see governments look back to 1984, which is sort of when the latest, the generation of Landsat that translates to today started. And you can look at that archive and say, what questions can we ask temporally that maybe would inform where we're going forward, or understanding our disturbance history or fire histories. This is where we're getting to now, is being able, asking 50 years ago what happened is no longer a question of what's the paper record, it's what's the satellite image tell us. And that's a very powerful opportunity that we can start to leverage. So I'd say that's the second one. And then open data, that varies by jurisdiction, but I think that's a critical piece to innovation, because if the data is open, then it's going to drive innovation, whether that's from the academic sector or whether that's from the private sector, or both. It's, if you just like, you look at GeoNB and you want to download any of the lidar data, whether it's for teaching or because you get your hands on some data, or that's just what you've got available, you can download the whole data set, and you can start to leverage and play around with that and say, so I want to test 16 hit per square meter lidar. I don't have any here, but they have some in New Brunswick, so I can download that and test how does my algorithm work in that situation versus lower density lidar in other jurisdictions, or whatever the case might be. And I think that's going to be key. If you ask me what's one thing I'd like to control across the country, it would be embracing a full open data policy, because if it's available, it's going to drive innovation, and we're all going to win out of that. The other, I think that'd be my number one. The other one would be proper documentation to follow. That's that varies widely and causes so many problems. Because I remember even the 4-band imagery we got for the ADS-40, I'd walk in and see companies looking at the wrong band order, thinking they're looking at RGB, but it was in reverse. And they said, well, this looks like garbage. And I said, well, yeah, because you're looking at the blue channel through the green, like you've got it in reverse.
Yeah,
but
looks funny.
Yeah, it's like, well, it wasn't communicated to them in a way that they could understand. And if you want to see the best documentation, to my mind, across the country, it's Quebec. You look at their lidar derivative data set, it's like a 60-page manual, step by step, QGIS and ArcGIS, embrace both sides, and say, you're not, because a lot of organizations use both. You run into this, I'm sure, where I need to run a buffer. I don't want to pay for my staff to have another advanced license just to run a buffer. I'm going to use QGIS for that geoprocess and then bring it back into ARC, or whatever the case might be. Those sorts of silly things or zonal statistics, another example of, you don't have the spatial analyst license, but you run zonal statistics through QGIS and bring it back in, you're off to the races. So leveraging both sides of the toolbox. We've seen white box tools being developed out of Southern Ontario. That's a fantastic tool set. The Orpheus image analysis tools that bring in, e-cognition like object-based image analysis into a free environment. The Snap toolbox that gives you access to the random forest algorithms right in QGIS. This open source environment has just blossomed. And come this June, the next version of QGIS, it now has LiDAR support, but the next version has got a real LiDAR suite of tools built in. Your profile tools are being built into that now. We're going to start seeing that really having a place in these new LiDAR inventories.
For sure. Yeah, and absolutely right. Like some of the GIS analytics tools, that they become commodities in terms of buffer and stuff like that. Yeah. The open source data is probably a broader discussion that we'd end up on a 3-hour call, honestly, as we start unpacking that. Great conversation there, but maybe move us into Ontario. We kind of hinted at that. So tell us more about what not obviously for some of our listeners globally, but Ontario's flying. They're in the program flying single photon lidar. So maybe for our listeners, share your understanding. How do we get to the point where we're flying SPL and not linear mode? And then where we're at, thinking of riffing off of that comment around open, are we there where you think we should be? And I'm kind of goading you in some of these comments.
Yeah, yeah,
Know that.
you want me to get in trouble, but that's okay. I don't mind. So for those that are interested in the Ontario Forest Inventory Program, I actually wrote a paper. It's an open access paper on the history of the forest inventory in Ontario. So it goes through the entire history going back to when we did aerial timber sketching and all the way through the different iterations and what the policy drivers were. And you know the critical drivers around the class timber EA that drove the new inventory and the ecological variables coming into it, and some of the warnings that used to be included in the inventory around it's a strategic level tool. It's not an operational tool without some sort of calibration. We lost that through the class timber EA, but we didn't change our methodology. So there was some challenges of scope and application of that inventory at the wrong scale, and then saying the inventory is wrong. It's like, well, its intended purpose was much higher level than where we were leveraging it. That was the real problem. So the new lidar that we're getting, single photon lidar or SPL, when the province announced it, it was fairly new for this type of acquisition in terms of this scale. I think Minnesota had done some or was in the process of doing some as well. But it's basically they can fly higher so they can cover larger land bases, and we've got a lot of area to cover. So I think it's the only way they could pay the bill was to go to SPL. The trade-off being we do have a bit of a mosaic patchwork of acquisition driven by smoke and that sort of thing. And I think people will just need to be very aware of the fact that some SFLs are going to have 2 or 3 years of lidar north to south, and it's not going to be in blocks. It's going to be in these sorts of ribbon patterns in some cases where a flight line was obscured by smoke and picked up the next year. And there could be some weird edge effects we run into, and it's just being aware of that when you start working with the data. But it's big too. I mean, if you talk to folks like Resolute, they'll tell you they just put a petabyte server in on-prem to be able to manage their land base and all the derivatives as they start leveraging this and drone technology. And the reason for that is, you know, in a lot of the province, we have good connectivity, but that's not the case everywhere. And being able to download the data is a real challenge for some of those locations. Having worked in, you know, the Ignaces and the Fort Francis area, there's real pipeline challenges when it comes to broadband. I finished my master's. I lived half an hour outside town, and I finished it on dial-up internet. And it wasn't that long ago. You know, it was there's real connectivity challenges even around this area. You don't have broadband available to everyone within half an hour of Thunder Bay.
So are you gonna start having seizures if I mimic the dial-up?
Oh yeah, exactly, right?
Like shuddering, right? Oh my god, not that sound. It's like not that dial-up sound. Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. So definitely I laugh because as I was setting up this podcast, you know, I did my speed test, you know, close to a gigabit coming down.
Oh yeah, same, right? Yeah.
20 MIPS, right? And then you're like, dial up. It's like, is this really an issue? It's like, oh yeah, definitely, for sure. So fascinating. And even as we talk about scale of data, maybe, and even compute resources, I know right now, even in the data centers like of Microsoft Azure and other places, they have capacity constraints because so many people are spinning up resources. And I think last time I read, some of these cloud providers had 60-70% year over year growth. So the demand is there, whether it's cloud or on-prem, like people are buying stuff to handle that. So on the SPL side of things, obviously, you know, provincial jurisdiction, they're the keepers. I was going to say gatekeepers, but the keepers of the data and moving things. Are you happy with where things are at? Do you think the previous refresh cycle, you know, we've collectively as a community learned from it and we're positioned well for success? Or do you think there's opportunities for growth? I'm sensing it's probably not technology. Like we got the tools to process this.
It's really more a question around like I think there's two things. One, the lack of photography is going to be a barrier for some folks. I think that's going to surprise a lot of foresters who still rely on well, they rely on aerial photos for everything, right? They're still leveraging the old the last round of photos just for being able to understand context. And the one problem that I've run into, just to give you an example for the SPL, is what I call a false bottom problem. So in a closed canopy understory balsam fir stand, for example, you may not get ground penetration, and so that gets called the bottom, and you get a misleading height. And so you're actually taking merchantable stands and calling them unmerchantable because you hit that false bottom. And without some photo base to try to give you some context, or maybe the last round told you it's two-tiered, some hint, it's very easy to miss that at a large landscape scale. And it's not to say that, this can't work. It's just that is one trade-off with SPL. We get a ton of upper canopy returns. Mid canopy, we don't get a lot. That's related to the green band and the solar noise question. And then the ground returns, we're getting a lot of artifacting in some places. It's only in certain stand types, but it's something we need to be aware of and grow through and figure out, how do we identify this? Is there sort of a hint in the lidar that exists and we can flag it?
Sure.
Whatever the case might be. But that's where I would start to worry as a forester now, doing a strategic plan, is am I bypassing merchantable wood because I'm artificially underreporting my heights at a landscape scale, and the scope of the data is such that you can't comb every stand.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we know where that story then goes. Oh, this thing's like a piece of insert beep.
Yeah,
It's a
exactly.
manual beep, right? I'm not using this. Like, didn't they do? Don't they know what they're doing? And
Yep.
versus knowledge transfer, exchange of information could fill that gap with other technology. So interesting there. So at the end of the day, like for me, it's always kudos to the province. They've moved forward. They made a
Yep.
decision. They're moving forward now in terms of knowledge transfer, education, training. That's where there's
Big
the
time.
opportunities. And so when we think about lidar, like again, it's like, would you agree it's one of the game changing
Oh
technology
yeah. Yeah,
forestry? Yeah.
I think it's going to be huge for being able to improve a lot of the metrics that people are expecting to get back. Like, you're driving a sawmill, or again, I always go back to Resolute. I understand their business situation a little more. They have 3 mills that have different demands, and that's a perfect example where lidar is going to give them the ability to sort and understand and predict wood volume flows to each one of those facilities. That's a fantastic utilization of this technology. And I think it is, I fully agree with you. I mean, we were joking before we started that the first time I learned about lidar, I brought a class to Hearst to a talk that you were giving, Kevin. I think it was 2013. I was looking it up.
That was a way back.
Way back. It was the early days, and seeing the early work that you were doing, it was really interesting stuff. But I didn't have that same in Ontario. We haven't had that same history with lidar at a larger scale in terms of like the educational background, like Quebec or out east has had, where it just matured to the point where they now have a better understanding. We're getting there in Ontario, but it's going to be a learning curve as we come up, and that's why leaning on these other jurisdictions and taking the wins that they had is going to be key.
For sure.
And then when I look at lidar inventory and I say, now what does that look like in like going forward? How do we leverage this, or how do we improve our models? I think it's going to go hand in hand with the machines, and tracking that information so that we get a constant feedback loop. You're seeing this in the Scandinavian countries now. There was an example of Komatsu doing full metrics of every tree they grab. They scan it, and then they just put 2 GPS units on a fixed boom that gives you machine orientation. And by having that, they can use all the other information to infer exactly where the tree was. Now you can recreate what was our actual realized inventory. And I think if you fast forward in 10 years, I think that's going to be the norm outside of some edge cases where contractors resist it. I really do, because that's going to be feedback. That's not going to solve all our inventory. That's going to solve our merchantable inventory.
Yeah,
That's
I
going to
love how
tighten.
you did that, Alex. I was just going to sneak this a couple paragraphs then and say, boom. All right. So let's unpack that for our listeners, because there's a lot of serious tech beyond just, oh, it's just two GPS things we infer.
Oh yeah, no big deal. Yeah.
Let's unpack that a little bit more. So we've been talking about airborne lidar to date. We're now
Yeah.
talking about other pieces of the forest products, the timber harvesting supply chain side of things. So for our listeners there, is that really the future, this fusion of, at a certain scale, you're using a certain type of GIS or geospatial product, and at some point it's not quite boots
Yep.
on the ground, maybe boots on the pedal with machinery. What's that world look like? And then again, in the context of Silvacom, maybe bring it together, because Silvacom is a big
Yeah.
technology shop. It's got some horsepower on that side. So what's that vision like? What can you share in terms of your vision of what that future looks like with the
Sure.
whole landscape in terms of technology and people, like drones, bringing in the drones. I know you're an expert in that space as well, right?
So the what you said there in terms of fusion, I think, is the key takeaway here, and also scale. I think we need to stop thinking about inventory as being one scale, and that is one challenge we run into when we talk to folks. Is they think I need the inventory. Well, okay, what is your question? And then let's give you the inventory to answer that question. And so there's the strategic level, the operational, and then ultimately the individual tree level. You start diving way down. And that's driven by different data products. So whether we're talking about satellite derived landscape level questions for habitat modeling, that's one scale. And then the technological side of things. So if you have got a machine, when it grabs the tree and it does a whole scan and you know exactly where that tree was, and you've got aerial lidar that tells you what it predicted volume was, you can now say, okay, we predicted X, we got Y, and over time we get millions and millions of measurements, and we can do a feedback loop to really tighten up those predictions and understand not just what is our inventory predicting for from an operational perspective, but how do we then correct for utilization. So we're not just predicting the merchantable volume that is available, but utilization parameters. And we think the machines can operate in the following conditions, but he couldn't reach these trees. Why? We can start to ask those questions to tighten up our utilization understanding of the entire system. And then if you want to fast forward even more, I presented this the day before at OFIA. There's a company called Air Forestry who is dreaming big thoughts, and it's pretty cool. They have an 80-kilogram drone with a felling head on it for thinning. They grab the tree from the top, strip the branches off, and cut it off and lift it out without any machine trails. So now you think about site improvement, or maybe black spruce harvesting where it's smaller trees. That's a drone that could do individual tree lifting out, no ground disturbance. So that opens up our operability, and that changes the entire game of logistics management. Now you've got a landing, a literal landing, not just a for all of that. And people hear that and think there's no way we could do that legislatively. Well, legislatively, by the end of the year, beyond visual line of sight is going to be normalized, at least in low density population areas. And the weight restrictions are going up to almost 600 kilos for the drone delivery business.
That's huge. Yeah.
So that already is opening it up, and that trajectory is massive. I mean, I use the example of zipline drones. They were delivering COVID vaccines. They delivered over 1 million COVID vaccines and flew 20 million miles of drone flights, like 800 times around the earth. That's where we are now. This is not science fiction, it's science fact. And you look at that type of opportunity and you say, if we put a landing into an area with good roads, like northeastern Ontario, good example, right? Where road building costs are a big problem. Most of the harvesting is done in the wintertime. We start talking about soil carbon considerations, compaction, all of those sorts of questions. What does that mean if you look at a stand and say, we can now do aerial harvesting? Maybe that's not today, but fast forward, a LiDAR driven inventory at an ITC level, that becomes a possibility, at least in some locations. And low population densities go hand in hand with where we operate. Yeah. So the risk profile is hand in hand. It doesn't speak to the Southern Ontario management necessarily, although with species at risk considerations and all the challenges that they have with building roads, it might actually be an environment that is conducive to it. And this system does handle hardwoods. Yeah. And so it's thinking big thoughts. It's thinking maybe that's possible, or some form of that, or a hybrid system, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that we could see that. So I think that's going to be really cool to see that, in some form. And if they start proving it out in Sweden, we've got the ground to justify it here. And what we have that they don't is even less population density. So we have low risk areas where we can go to prove out this technology, where if it goes rogue, it can't reach a population center by the time it runs out of fuel. Yeah. And that's the advantage that we've got with the big land base that we have, is we can start to ask these questions and test it out and prove it out and say, what does this mean for ground compaction? Roads planning becomes a very different question.
Yeah, for sure. And I know a bunch of our listeners are probably, listening or watching this going like, guys, this will never happen. And for me, I always say it's a lot easier to come up with the reasons why we can't do it versus come to the table with how are we going to do it, and there's who knows what the future looks like, but
Yep.
it's crazy exciting. And even this is where I joke, some people ask me like, do you see autonomous like harvesting machines, forestry machines coming? I'm like yeah, like does that
Yeah.
scare the bejesus of you? I'm like, no. They're like, why not? Because now I got flying drones flying around with things that can cut my head off versus at least that ginormous thing, that piece of iron I can hear rumbling down and run faster than it versus a flaming drone. Like, oh my god. Well,
Yep.
we won't go into our Terminator scenarios here. So very cool on that front. Anything surprising you on the drone side? We kind of touched it. You mentioned some companies are doing that. Definitely, as we watch the landscape, lots of drone forestry companies raising some VC dollars and getting into the space, whether it's coming through climate tech dollars or some other avenue. At some point they maybe all mesh together that it's forestry, but maybe driven by ESG or some other component. But
Yep.
aside from the lidar, we've been talking about airborne lidar, the drones and other, any other cool technologies, like thinking of the 1, 3, 5 year time frame. What,
So,
like, we've kind of gone all over the place, like without
yeah.
even asking. You took us 1 year to 20 to 5 to 16, and then and so you pick now what range you want to work in. But what
All
gets you
right.
excited in the morning?
So let me reel it in to sort of frame it, because like you said, you always run into that skepticism. And I say in 2013 there was a TED talk about drone delivery possibilities, and it's now 2022 and it's happening at scale, including in North America for Walmart in Arkansas. Same company, Zipline Drones. So I always say you look at that trajectory, it is coming. Planet is another example. Daily monitoring of the entire world, whether it's a line scanner of the world. You can ask daily questions now multiple times a day. Since April 2017, I've been involved in their Planet Education and Research program. So unlimited worldwide access to it, which is pretty awesome. Being able to ask any question you want anywhere in the world and challenging students. When I look forward to satellite data, seeing hyperspectral, that's the next big one that's going to be a driver for us to be able to fuse with lidar and ask different questions. You're seeing the German company Nmap has just announced the 30-meter resolution. That's going to align largely with Landsat, 230 spectral bands, full SWIR. We can really geek out about why that's cool, but you think about being able to monitor facility level carbon emissions, being able to monitor, do species level inferences, insect outbreaks. You're seeing that. Wyvern, which is a Canadian company, is a satellite company based in Alberta. They're launching at the end of this year 1 meter visual near infrared and then 5-meter SWIR with 30 spectral channels. That's a fantastic Canadian technology story. And then Planet is their carbon mapper project with California, where they're launching that. I mean, you look at that, and then the recent job ads around hyperspectral, they're going to be in that space as well. So hyperspectral, where we go beyond the 4 bands into the so people always ask, what does hyperspectral mean? And I say, well, right now we take a lot of information and average it together, and we kind of call it red. And we say this stuff is all kind of blue, right? But we miss a lot of nuance. It's an average. And so what hyperspectral gives us is the ability to take very fine slices and say, instead of averaging all this data together, to me, it's the spectral version of LiDAR. We're not averaging the height of the block. We're not averaging the spectral signature of the block. We're taking very narrow slices and asking individual questions, and we can build indices to give us far more insights than we've got today. I mean, in jurisdictions not driven by glacial history, biogeoprospecting becomes a factor for the mining industry, because you see the associated metals with gold deposits being taken up into the vegetation. Eucalypts will take up gold into the vegetation, and hyperspectral gives you the ability to see that. So I think that's going to be critical. Open source technology is going to be a big driver. I always say open source and paid software go hand in hand. It's not one or the other, it's both, because they drive innovation. It opens up opportunity for small organizations, and it drives innovation. You see tools come out in the open source community, and eventually, once it's stable or makes enough sense, it gets adopted by the paid software, where you need it to be stable and work, and not spend half your day swearing at Python for not working today. So it's that whole balancing act.
And for our listeners, for context, when Alex says swear, he's not swearing at you, right? You're shortwave infrared. You got some jargon happening here, right? So, and I say this again for my sister, love you, Jen, but I know she always asks, like, you got to slow down with some of these people. It's like, I don't know anything about your space. It's like, I'm trying to follow. And I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, I'll try my best. So lots there. I'm
Yes,
curious,
sorry.
because you're still teaching. Are you
Yes.
seeing a trend with foresters? As you can sense the excitement in your voice. Is that translating to the students? Like, are they connecting the dots equally as well and going like,
Yes.
holy SHI exclamation mark T? It's like I want to get in
Yeah.
this space. Are you seeing that trend, that
Uh,
generational shift?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, so when we grew up, I always say for us, technology was always something that you had to kind of fight your way through. It didn't just work. We weren't the app generation where things you press it and it just worked the first time. It's like, if it worked at all, it's like, oh, excellent. And so it's overcoming a little bit of that. Like I made them open a command line window for the first time. They'd never seen that before. So basic stuff to understand batch processing. But the excitement is there when they start to be able to define a problem and then execute it. And they're really seeing that. So with Planet, you imagine you're a student now in fourth year, and your task with your term project is you have access to imagery everywhere, every day in the entire world, and you can download as much of it as you want and ask any question. I get all kinds of weird analyses from looking at how is the ice changing on Lake Superior day over day, to flooding in Bangladesh, to cutting and thinning from below in the high forests of South America. Students are excited when they get access to that kind of information, and then they see opportunities like full-time drone pilot. Two former students are now full-time drone pilots. That's all they do every day. When it's nice weather, they're out flying. When it's crummy weather, they're inside processing or doing planning. Like that is a full-time career now. And you say that to them and they realize, wow, I can leverage everything that I've done here to answer real questions, but I still get to play out in the field as well and live that balanced life. And I think especially a lot of foresters, at least for their first 10 years, 15 years, want that real balance of
Yeah,
half office. That's always a big push.
yeah,
And
no
so
doubt.
that's been a real exciting thing to see. And it is translating. They're asking more complex questions, but it does require changing the curriculum. So this was the first time I taught lidar, as the advanced course was all lidar this year for the first time.
Wow.
And so that was a real pivot by distance on their home computers. So you're having to leverage whatever you can. Some of them are Mac. I was a Mac person, but in this space, it's a real pain to be a Mac person.
For sure.
So it led to some challenges that way, but it's been really fun. And then you see them now asking new questions as they go into their career, and they still reach out and stay in contact with them. And so you get to see where they go with their career and how they've leveraged the stuff you've taught them, which has been really cool to see. And then I think that.
Yeah, it's amazing. All you can do as a professor, right, is kind of plant the seed and see where they take it. But it is rewarding to see them spread their wings, and who knows, 1, 3,
Yeah.
5, 10 years, as you said, even your ranger school, reconnecting down the road. It's a small community. So kudos for you bringing that passion to teaching the next generation. So thinking about, as we're looking to wind down, thinking about our listeners
Yep.
might be going, okay, like what else does Silvacom do? You guys been
Sure.
talking, you've been geeking out. What else is Silvacom about? If I want to engage with him,
Sure.
maybe give a pitch on Silvacom and all the cool things. I know what they do, Silvacom does, but for our listeners, share all the cool, wicked things that you guys do.
Yeah, so I'll try to cover sort of the broad strokes of it, and then obviously people can reach out if they have specific questions. So we've got a number of different verticals involved in the company, and so when you look at the two software verticals, for example, used by forest industry, one is a forest management software. It's called Silvacom FMS, forest management software, and it's a cloud-based system that's designed to try to reduce some of the friction points for GIS management, saving time and effort in completing their planning activities and managing all of their digital assets. And that's a Canada-wide product. And Zach Cole at Silvacom is the person that would be more than happy to talk your ear off on that product and the offerings. And it does actually tie in with your company as well, Kevin. So FMS is inventory product agnostic. And so we're tied right in with Lim Afrids and delivering that through FMS to clients as well. So it's not tied to just one inventory solution. If you want to try raster based, you want to change the way that it operates, it's agnostic to that and can leverage all of it. The other one is called Jambo. and it's a product for organizations to manage all their stakeholder engagement, whether that's local citizens committees, indigenous community work like that, and associated commitments. And it's used by a lot of forestry clients across Canada and some international clients as well. And Ward Ferguson is the one that can lead people and help them understand the full potential there. That's sort of your one-stop shop, being able to manage all of those disparate communications and showing things like for your FSC commitments. Did you do consultation? Where did you do that? Where's the proof of all of that? It's sort of like Salesforce, if Salesforce was designed for the resource sector. And our sort of tagline internally and externally is built by foresters for foresters. And it's that lens of it working for the day-to-day challenges, and we understand what those challenges are. And then I'm part of the professional services vertical, which is more your traditional consulting work, but it's spatial modeling, it's inventory development, it's leveraging all these different inventory solutions, whether they are EFIs or full raster-based inventories, ITCs, whatever the inventory input is. It's how do we get that to work in the policy framework? And that's actually a big challenge across Canada, is that hasn't been fully thought through in all jurisdictions. Is we don't have a policy framework that's designed to ingest these inventory products, or they expect a full polygon inventory in some cases. And we can draw lines on the map, but do they mean anything anymore? Is that just topographic break lines? Like, why are we drawing those lines? So that's going to be a challenge, but policy always takes longer than technology. That's forever been a trend, and I don't see that going away. It's figuring out right now, how do we take this fantastic data and still make it meet a policy framework? So we're doing that right now with forest management plans and as well as spatial modeling optimization, which there's been a bit of a history of that in Ontario, but there hasn't been as much as there is in other jurisdictions where they're far more volume or area based limited, so they have to optimize. We just have this tradition of, well, if it's not there, I'll swap it over here kind of a thing, right? It's this endless wood basket. But with the goal in Ontario to maximize the AAC by 2030, we may start seeing the pressures there to bring that optimization in, which the lidar inventory is well positioned to help feed into.
Absolutely. So thinking of like pro tips, are people who are listening to this episode, this show, or watching, I should say, and they say, hey, like, totally cool dude, listening to Alex. It's like, yeah, a lot, like, obviously knowledge base here available for people to tap into. Pro tips for getting started, like if they're interested in lidar, drones, or whatever that may be, are there certain common things you've seen where people just kind of get tripped up, or maybe they're asking the wrong questions? Any pro tips you'd share with the community?
I'd say be willing to reach out on LinkedIn and just have a conversation. Like, people in this space are very friendly. And we're pretty willing to share things. Like, we're not going to share the secret sauce of how our exact software solution works, but if someone reaches out to me and says, I'm really interested in lidar, can you point me to some good tutorial materials? Like, that's very easy to have that conversation and get people going. And I think that is universal of pretty much everyone you've interviewed to date. I think that is a universal trend in this digital forestry community. It's a big small town, I like to say, and it might be a big geography, but we're all willing to sit around and chat and share things. It's not this, it's not antagonistic. It's very much let's find a solution and figure out what can work. And so someone that's interested, just be willing to reach out and have that conversation, and then dive in with both feet, and don't be afraid for your computer to seize up a few times. It's going to happen in the early days of it. So
yeah, smoke is good. You can use your computer to heat your house.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, hey, man, awesome to talk with you. I loved it. Again, it's been great. I have not had to ask too many questions. It's refreshing just letting someone run with their passion and share their thoughts and experiences. So as we close down, for people who are listening and they want to get in touch with you, I know you've talked with shared some of the names from the Silvacom team, but obviously you're the first guy to ping, and you can open the doors into the Silvacom family. But What's the best way to get a hold of you? Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, email, website, a
I
TikTok, who knows? What's the best way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I considered a TikTok channel. I guess that could be entertaining, but no, not quite. So I'll say email is alex.bilyk@silvacom.com, or just going to the website. You can find our contact details there. LinkedIn is another great one. Like I said, don't be shy to reach out and connect. It's always willing to have a conversation and chat with people and share experiences and just chat in general. So.
For
And I
sure.
really
So,
appreciate you having me on here, Kevin. It's been
hey man, no,
fantastic.
it's awesome. So for our listeners, Alex, Alex dot Bilyk, Bilyk at silvacom.com. So feel free to reach out. Thanks so much for carving off some time to talk with me, share some of your experiences. It was super cool. Now I know everyone's either driving or walking, going like, oh my God, is there a drone up there with that's going to come down? Exciting time. So awesome. As always, appreciate the time we spend together and chat, and looking for the next time we can see each other in person and continue on.
Absolutely. Thanks
Cool.
a lot, Kevin.
Cool. Thanks very much.